How much longer do you think your skills are relevant in today's market, Sophia? Marcus Chen asked, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against his glass desk. His smile never reached his eyes. 15 years is a long time to rely on the same playbook. I stared at the sleek dismissal letter placed before me, the company logo embossed in gold at the top. After dedicating my prime years to Vertex Technologies, I was being discarded exactly 1 week before my stock options would fully vest. This wasn't about relevance. This was robbery in a designer suit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The 43rd floor executive suite of Vertex Technologies' downtown headquarters had always intimidated visitors with its calculated minimalism. Glass walls offering vertiginous views of the city skyline, furniture in various shades of white, and chrome that valued form over function, and abstract art pieces selected more for their investment potential than aesthetic appeal. The room was designed to make people feel small, and on that Thursday afternoon, it was succeeding. I adjusted my navy blazer, the same one I'd worn to countless product launches and board presentations over my 15-year tenure, and maintained my composure as Marcus Chen, newly appointed CEO of Vertex Technologies, continued speaking. The words themselves were less important than the practiced casualness with which he delivered them. This wasn't an impromptu meeting. This was a choreographed execution. The technology landscape has evolved dramatically since you joined us, he continued, sliding a bound document across his immaculate glass desk. Your contributions have been valuable. But Vertex needs forward-looking leadership in product development now. We're pivoting toward emerging markets and cutting-edge innovation. I glanced at the document, 15 pages of legal terminology that essentially translated to leave quietly or get nothing. My severance package, 3-month salary in exchange for signing away my right to contest the termination or discuss company matters with outside parties. The timing was surgical. Exactly 7 days before my stock options would fully vest after 15 years of service, options currently valued at nearly $4 million. You're terminating my position, I stated rather than asked, my voice steadier than I felt. At 47, I had spent nearly a third of my life building Vertex's product division from a struggling software vendor into an industry leader with a portfolio of patents and innovations that generated 68% of the company's current revenue. We're restructuring the product development division, Marcus corrected with rehearsed empathy. Your position is being eliminated as part of our strategic realignment. Beside him sat Naomi Wells, the new head of human resources who had joined Vertex just 3 months ago, around the same time as Marcus. She hadn't spoken yet, but her presence served its purpose. Official witness, institutional memory eraser. She occasionally nodded at Marcus's statements with practiced professionalism while studiously avoiding eye contact with me. And this restructuring coincidentally occurs 1 week before my stock options vest, I observed, my tone deliberately neutral. Marcus's expression flickered briefly, irritation at having the subtext spoken aloud. The timing of our strategic decisions is based on market conditions and shareholder priorities, he replied, the corporate platitudes flowing effortlessly. Your options package reflects the standard contractual terms you agreed to upon joining Vertex. Standard contractual terms that had been modified twice during my tenure, most recently when I had declined a lucrative offer from our largest competitor 3 years ago. The retention agreement had been personally approved by our previous CEO, Jonathan Ward, who had retired 6 months earlier after building Vertex from a small tech startup into a Fortune 500 company. I thought about the projects currently under my supervision, particularly the Helios platform, our next-generation integration system that had been my focus for the past 18 months. The platform was scheduled for beta release in exactly 5 weeks. I had personally recruited and assembled the development team, structured the architecture, and secured 3 patents that protected our most innovative features. What happens to the Helios project? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Brandon Davis will be stepping in as interim director for product development. He'll oversee the completion and launch of current projects, Marcus replied, naming my most recently hired senior manager, a talented but inexperienced developer who had joined us from a competitor 8 months ago. Brandon was brilliant with code but had limited understanding of our legacy systems and industry relationships, knowledge that couldn't be transferred in handover notes or transition meetings. He also lacked the historical context of why certain architectural decisions had been made, the invisible foundations upon which our technology was built. Most concerning was his limited experience navigating the complex regulatory requirements governing our healthcare and financial services integrations. Brandon doesn't have clearance for the financial services implementations, I noted. The compliance certification takes minimum 6 weeks, and Treasury regulations require a certified officer for the deployment phase. For a moment, uncertainty crossed Marcus's face before Naomi interjected smoothly. We'll be temporarily bringing in compliance consultants to bridge any certification gaps, she explained. We've contracted with GrayPath Advisors to ensure all regulatory requirements are met during the transition. GrayPath was a well-known consulting firm that specialized in rapid deployments, but had a reputation for prioritizing speed over security, a particularly concerning approach for financial technology with access to sensitive customer data. The firm had been involved in 2 significant data breach incidents in the past 3 years, though their legal team had successfully deflected most liability. I see, I replied, the implications crystallizing. They weren't just removing me. They were systematically dismantling the safeguards and due diligence processes I had built into our development pipeline. Processes that occasionally slowed deployment, but had given Vertex an unblemished security record in an industry plagued by breaches and vulnerabilities. Your team has been informed that you're taking a personal leave effective immediately, Naomi continued. To minimize disruption, we've communicated that you'll be unavailable for the coming weeks. Your direct reports will transition to Brandon's supervision starting tomorrow morning. The calculated efficiency of the process confirmed what I already suspected. This decision had been in motion for weeks, carefully orchestrated to appear sudden while being meticulously planned. My team had been kept in the dark, just as I had been. When do you need my decision on the severance agreement? I asked, my mind already processing several contingency paths. Monday by noon would be optimal, Marcus replied, glancing at Naomi, for confirmation. Given the sensitivity of your position, we've arranged for your personal effects to be packed and delivered to your residence by courier this evening. Your system access has been suspended effective 30 minutes ago. Of course it had. I had noticed my company phone receive a silent update during our meeting, undoubtedly removing my access credentials and possibly installing monitoring software to track any communications I might attempt with colleagues. For security purposes, Gerald will escort you to the reception area, Naomi added, referring to the security officer undoubtedly waiting outside. The final humiliation being walked out like a potential threat rather than someone who had helped build the company from its foundations. I closed the severance folder without opening it further and stood, smoothing my skirt with the same precision I had applied to product specifications for 15 years. I'll review the documents and respond by Monday, I said, maintaining the professional composure that had become my trademark at Vertex. Marcus appeared slightly surprised by my calm response, perhaps expecting tears, anger, or desperate negotiation. In truth, a strange clarity was emerging through the initial shock. This wasn't merely corporate politics or cost-cutting. The systematic dismantling of security protocols, the rushed handover to inexperienced leadership, the timing preceding a major product launch, these elements suggested something more concerning than simple financial opportunism. I appreciate your professionalism, Sophia, Marcus said, standing and extending his hand as if we had concluded a routine business meeting rather than ended a 15-year career. Vertex has benefited greatly from your contributions. I shook his hand briefly, noting the perfect temperature and pressure of his grip, likely practiced in executive coaching sessions. 15 years provides valuable perspective, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. Especially about patterns and consequences. The subtle shift in his expression confirmed that my meaning had registered. I wasn't threatening. I was simply acknowledging that I understood more than he had calculated. As expected, Gerald was waiting outside, a young security officer who had joined Vertex only months ago and had no context for who I was or what my departure signified. He maintained an uncomfortable professional distance as we walked through the product development floor where my team was conspicuously absent, likely called to an impromptu meeting to ensure I wouldn't encounter them during my exit. The elevator ride to the lobby was silent, the security officer checking his watch repeatedly as if to verify that proper protocols were being followed. When we reached the ground floor, he gestured toward the main entrance. "Thank you for your cooperation. Ms. Walker, have a good afternoon." I nodded politely and walked through the soaring lobby that I had helped design during the headquarters renovation 5 years earlier. The security turnstiles, once programmed to greet me by name, now required Gerald's override to allow my exit. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Outside, the September sun felt unexpectedly bright, the ordinary rhythm of downtown continuing undisturbed by the professional execution I had just experienced. I checked my personal phone, which contained only private accounts unconnected to Vertex Systems. Rather than calling a rideshare as I typically would after working late, I decided to walk the 18 blocks to my condominium. The physical movement would help process what had just happened and what needed to happen next. Because while Marcus Chen believed he had just neutralized a dispensable middle-aged executive, what he had actually done was activate someone with comprehensive knowledge of Vertex's systems, partnerships, and vulnerabilities. Someone who had maintained relationships with key clients, developers, and regulators throughout the industry. Someone who had documented every questionable decision, rejected security recommendation, and compliance shortcut she had witnessed over 15 years. I wasn't just Sophia Walker, recently terminated product development director. I was the institutional memory and conscience of Vertex Technologies, and I had just been freed from all corporate constraints on using that knowledge. By the time I reached my building, the initial shock had transformed into strategic clarity. I greeted Thomas, the doorman who had known me since I purchased my condominium 8 years earlier, with my usual smile. "Everything all right, Ms. Walker?" he asked, noting my earlier-than-usual arrival. "You're home before sunset for once." "Just a change in schedule, Thomas," I replied. "I might be working from home for a while." "About time they let you have some balance," he said approvingly. "You're always the last one home in the building." If only he knew. In my apartment, I immediately went to my home office, a space I rarely used except on weekends, given my typically long hours at Vertex. I powered on my personal laptop and created a secure document to record every detail of the termination meeting while it remained fresh in my memory. Not for potential litigation, though that remained an option, but because comprehensive documentation had always been my professional methodology. Understanding complex systems required capturing details that might initially seem insignificant, but later prove critically important. As I finished documenting the meeting, my doorbell rang. The courier had arrived with my personal effects, 15 years of professional life contained in 2 cardboard boxes. I signed for them and brought them to my dining table, carefully unpacking each item. The packing had been hasty and impersonal. Framed certificates stacked against coffee mugs, technical books jumbled with personal photographs, award plaques wrapped in my spare gym clothes. Among the items was a framed photograph from Vertex's 10th anniversary celebration, me standing beside Jonathan Ward, the founder and former CEO, both of us smiling as we unveiled the company's refreshed brand identity. Jonathan's arm was around my shoulder, his expression capturing the genuine enthusiasm that had characterized his leadership. A stark contrast to Marcus Chen's calculated corporate persona. I set the photograph on my desk and continued unpacking. At the bottom of the second box, I found my personal notebooks. 12 years of handwritten notes from meetings, product development sessions, and strategic planning retreats. While all official documentation remained on Vertex's servers, these personal notes contained my unfiltered observations, concerns raised but not addressed, and the context behind key decisions that official minutes never captured. These notebooks had accompanied me to every significant meeting, their presence so constant that executives and team members alike had stopped noticing them. Their contents weren't confidential company documents, but rather my personal professional diary, protected by the same privacy conventions that covered personal journals or creative works developed on personal time. I placed the notebooks on my desk and sat back, considering my options. The severance agreement waited in my bag, its terms designed to silence me and sever all claims to compensation I had rightfully earned. Signing it would provide 3 months' salary, but cost me stock options worth millions, and, more importantly, would legally restrict my ability to protect the projects and people I had invested years developing. My phone chimed with a text message from Brandon Davis, the colleague who would be inheriting my position. Just heard the news. This is completely unexpected. Can we talk? I considered my response carefully. Brandon wasn't part of the executive decision-making process that had orchestrated my removal. He was talented but inexperienced, likely being positioned as a convenient scapegoat if the rushed Helios deployment encountered problems. Not through company channels, I texted back, personal email only. I then turned off notifications and focused on what needed to happen next. The severance agreement required my signature by Monday, which gave me 3 days to fully assess the situation and determine my response. 3 days to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened precisely when it did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Because while Marcus Chen and the new executive team saw me as an expensive legacy resource, with outdated skills, what they failed to understand was that my value wasn't in writing code or designing user interfaces. My value was in the comprehensive understanding of complex interconnected systems, both technological and human, that could only be developed through years of focused attention. They had dismissed me as outdated, but as I reviewed my notebooks and considered the timing of recent decisions, a troubling pattern began to emerge, one that suggested outdated wasn't their actual concern. The real issue was that I knew too much, observed too carefully, and, most dangerously, had the institutional credibility to raise questions that others couldn't dismiss. As evening fell, I organized my notes chronologically and began reconstructing the events of the past 6 months since Jonathan Ward's retirement, the personnel changes, the shifted priorities, the accelerated timelines for financial integrations, the reduced security testing windows. Each decision individually seemed like typical corporate evolution under new leadership. Collectively, they formed a more concerning picture. By midnight, I had constructed a detailed timeline that confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't just about saving my salary or avoiding my stock options. This was about removing the primary obstacle to a fundamentally flawed product deployment strategy that prioritized speed and market positioning over security and stability. A strategy that, based on my technical assessment, had approximately a 70% probability of resulting in significant system vulnerabilities within the first 90 days of deployment. The question was no longer whether I should fight this termination, but how to do so in a way that protected the company's customers, employees, and long-term viability, even if its current leadership seemed determined to sacrifice those priorities for short-term gain. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed again. An email from an address I hadn't seen in years. Jonathan Ward, the retired founder of Vertex Technologies. The subject line read simply, "We should talk." Perhaps I wasn't the only one who had observed the troubling pattern of decisions, and perhaps being outdated in the eyes of those prioritizing speed over substance wasn't the liability they believed it to be. I smiled for the first time since the termination meeting. Monday's deadline suddenly seemed less threatening and more like an opportunity. Because while Marcus Chen believed he had eliminated a problem by removing me from Vertex Technologies, what he had actually done was create something much more dangerous: a highly motivated expert with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Sleep eluded me that night despite physical exhaustion. My mind continued processing the day's events, examining them from different angles like debugging complex code. By 5:30 a.m., I abandoned the pretense of rest and made my way to the kitchen, brewing the first of what would likely be many cups of coffee. The city was still dark outside my windows, the financial district's skyscrapers illuminated only by security lighting and the occasional office where someone was working improbably early or perhaps improbably late. Jonathan Ward's email remained unopened. I wanted full mental clarity before engaging with my former mentor and the man who had founded Vertex Technologies from his garage 23 years ago. Jonathan had personally recruited me from a promising position at a larger tech firm, convincing me that at Vertex I could build something meaningful rather than merely maintaining someone else's creation. "We're not just making software," he had told me during my interview. "We're making tools that help businesses serve people better." That philosophy had guided Vertex's product development under his leadership, balancing innovation with stability, growth with security. The company's unblemished record regarding data protection hadn't been accidental. It had been foundational to our corporate identity. With coffee in hand, I settled at my dining table where I had spread my notebooks the previous evening. The morning light gradually strengthened, illuminating 15 years of carefully documented observations. I reached for my phone and opened Jonathan's email. "Sophia, heard about yesterday's decision. Not what I envisioned for the company. My contact details are below. Secure channels only. JW." Brief and careful. Jonathan had always been judicious. In his written communications, particularly regarding sensitive matters, the reference to secure channels indicated his awareness that standard communications might be monitored, a reasonable precaution given the circumstances. I crafted an equally careful reply from my personal email account. "Available to connect at your convenience. Prefer in person if possible." While waiting for his response, I returned to my notebooks, focusing on entries from the past 6 months, since Jonathan's retirement and Marcus Chen's appointment as CEO. I had documented the initial transition meetings, including Marcus's ambitious growth targets and his repeated references to unnecessary procedural barriers in our product development cycle, his thinly veiled criticism of our security and compliance protocols. One entry from 3 months ago stood out particularly. During a product strategy meeting, I had raised concerns about the accelerated timeline for the Helios platform integration with Global Financial Network, a consortium of banking institutions that would be using our software to process transactions worth billions daily. The compliance certification requires a minimum of 3 sequential security audits, I had noted. Each audit cycle takes 2 weeks, plus remediation time if issues are identified. Marcus had dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. Other vendors achieve certification with a single audit. Find a way to streamline the process. What? My notes recorded, but the official minutes omitted, was my response. Those vendors have experienced security breaches. Our protocol exists because it works. The following day, Marcus had introduced Naomi Wells as our new head of human resources, along with 3 new board members with backgrounds primarily in venture capital rather than technology. Within weeks, several long-standing executives had announced their decisions to pursue other opportunities, the standard euphemism for encouraged departures. My phone chimed with Jonathan's response. Meridian Coffee House, 10 a.m., corner table. At the back. Meridian was a small independent cafe known for its lack of surveillance cameras and limited cellular reception, an increasingly rare combination in the digital age. It was also located in a neighborhood far from Vertex headquarters, or the homes of current executives, making a chance encounter unlikely. I spent the next 2 hours systematically reviewing my documentation of the Helios platform development, particularly the security and compliance aspects that Marcus had consistently pushed to accelerate. The pattern became increasingly clear. AI, systematic dismantling of safeguards in favor of speed and market positioning. Most concerning was the handling of the encryption protocols for financial transaction data. My team had designed a triple-layer encryption system that, while requiring slightly more processing power, provided security that exceeded industry standards. 2 months ago, I discovered that Marcus had authorized a streamlined version for the final release, maintaining the appearance of our security architecture while reducing its actual effectiveness. I had documented my objection in a formal memo, copying our Chief Technology Officer and Chief Compliance Officer. The CTO had supported my position initially, but reversed course after a private meeting with Marcus. The CCO position had been vacant since Linda Matthews' departure 3 months earlier, with responsibilities temporarily assigned to legal affairs. I photographed these specific notebook entries, along with supporting details from other meetings, and transferred the images to an encrypted storage service unconnected to Vertex systems. The documentation wasn't just a professional record anymore. It was becoming evidence of potentially negligent corporate governance. At 9:15 a.m., I changed into casual weekend attire, jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes, deliberately different from my usual business appearance. I tucked my hair under a rarely worn cap and added sunglasses before leaving my building. The precautions might seem excessive, but 15 years in technology had taught me that digital surveillance was ubiquitous, and facial recognition systems were increasingly deployed by corporate security teams. The morning was unseasonably warm for September, the sidewalks already crowded with weekend shoppers and tourists. I took an intentionally circuitous route to Meridian Coffee House, including a subway ride and a brief stop at a bookstore to ensure I wasn't being followed. The habits of careful system testing had their applications outside of software development. I arrived at Meridian at precisely 9:55 a.m., scanning the cafe before entering. Jonathan was already seated at the back corner table as promised, his appearance markedly different from the polished executive I had known. His previously close-cropped silver hair had grown longer, and he had cultivated a beard that softened his recognizable features. He wore a casual flannel shirt rather than the tailored suits that had been his corporate uniform. He rose slightly as I approached, his handshake warm and familiar despite the circumstances. "Sophia, thank you for coming." "It's good to see you, Jonathan," I replied, meaning it sincerely. Despite his transformed appearance, his eyes retained the sharp intelligence and genuine warmth that had made him such an effective leader, someone people followed from respect rather than obligation. A server approached, and we both ordered coffee, waiting until she departed before continuing our conversation. "I heard what happened," Jonathan began, his voice low. "My sources inside Vertex are diminishing, but I still have a few loyal connections. The timing wasn't subtle. 7 days before full vesting, I confirmed, though I believe the stock options were a secondary consideration." Jonathan's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain." "The Helios platform launches in 5 weeks," I said, with critical financial services integrations scheduled for immediate deployment. The security architecture has been systematically compromised over the past 3 months, and the compliance certification process has been abbreviated to the point of near meaninglessness. I briefly outlined the specific changes I had documented, including the substitution of our proprietary encryption system with a commercially available alternative that had experienced known vulnerabilities. Jonathan listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about technical details or timeline adjustments. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "They're prioritizing speed to market over security," he said, though it wasn't a question. Classic short-term thinking. "It's worse than that," I replied. "The changes aren't being documented properly in the technical specifications. Clients aren't being informed that the security architecture they contracted for has been fundamentally altered." Jonathan's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "That crosses the line from aggressive business practice to potential fraud." Exactly why I believe my termination wasn't primarily about cost reduction, I concluded. I was asking too many questions, documenting too many discrepancies. With me gone, Brandon will be overwhelmed just managing the basic product release requirements. He won't have bandwidth to investigate security architecture modifications or compliance shortcuts. Jonathan was silent for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, a habit I recognized from tense board meetings when he was processing difficult information. "I made a mistake with Marcus," he finally said, his voice heavy with regret. "The board wanted someone with aggressive growth credentials to please the institutional investors. His resume was impressive, his references impeccable. But I failed to see that his successes came from extracting value rather than creating it." "You couldn't have known," I offered. Jonathan shook his head firmly. "I should have looked deeper. His previous companies showed a pattern: impressive short-term growth followed by troubling aftermaths once he departed with his performance bonuses. Nothing illegal, nothing that would appear in standard background checks, but a consistent pattern of prioritizing metrics over sustainability." This explained why Jonathan had reached out. His concern wasn't just for me or even for the company he had built. It was for the potential harm that could result from compromised financial systems affecting millions of individuals whose data flowed through Vertex software. "What are you planning to do?" he asked directly. I hesitated, organizing my thoughts. "I have 3 paths available. First, sign the severance agreement, walk away, and hope the security compromises are discovered before serious harm occurs. Second, refuse to sign, hire counsel, and challenge the termination, which would likely initiate a lengthy legal process during which the Helios platform would still launch with compromised security. Or third." I paused, measuring my words carefully. "The third option involves ensuring that the relevant information reaches those with the authority to require proper security implementation before the launch: regulatory bodies, key clients, and potentially the full Vertex board, many of whom may not understand the technical implications of the changes being implemented." Jonathan considered this for a moment. "The third option carries significant personal risk. They'll claim you're violating confidentiality, potentially even intellectual property protections." "I'm aware," I acknowledged, "but I've been careful to document concerns through proper channels before my termination. I've maintained personal notes rather than copying company documents. And most importantly, the potential harm from compromised financial systems far outweighs the personal risk." Jonathan studied me with a newfound respect, no longer looking at the talented product director he had mentored, but at a professional equal making a principled stand. "You'd be sacrificing your severance at minimum," he noted. "Potentially, facing litigation as well." "Some things matter more than money," I replied simply. "You taught me that, Jonathan. Vertex was built on the principle that we serve people first, profit second. I still believe in that vision, even if current leadership doesn't." He nodded slowly, a decision visibly forming. "If you choose the third path, you shouldn't walk it alone." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card with a single name printed on it: Elizabeth Carver. "State Financial Services Regulator," Jonathan explained. "Formerly with the Federal Office of Technology Assessment. Impeccable, reputation for fairness and discretion. She understands both the technical and regulatory aspects of financial technology." I took the card carefully. "You know her personally?" We served together on a cybersecurity advisory committee for the Treasury Department 5 years ago, he confirmed. She's thorough, ethical, and most importantly, she focuses on preventing harm rather than merely punishing wrongdoing. This was exactly the type of contact I needed. Someone with the authority to intervene without necessarily destroying Vertex in the process. My goal wasn't vengeance but correction, not punishment but prevention. Thank you, I said, tucking the card into my pocket. This helps considerably. There's something else you should know, Jonathan added, leaning forward slightly. Marcus has been systematically replacing board members who might question his methods. 3 of my appointees have been eased out over the past 4 months, replaced with his former colleagues and financial allies. The board's technical oversight capacity has been deliberately diminished. This explained the accelerating pace of concerning decisions. The internal checks and balances that had previously maintained Vertex's commitment to quality and security had been strategically removed. Is there anyone left on the board who might understand the technical implications of these changes? I asked. Dr. Yamamoto is still there, Jonathan replied, referring to the computer science professor who had been one of Vertex's earliest investors. But he's been systematically isolated from technical reviews, told that his expertise is more valuable for strategic guidance than operational oversight. Our conversation continued for another hour, Jonathan sharing critical context about organizational changes while I outlined the specific technical concerns I had documented. Together, we constructed a clearer picture of what appeared to be a deliberate strategy to extract short-term value at the expense of long-term stability and security. What will you do next? Jonathan asked as our meeting concluded. Review the severance agreement carefully, particularly the confidentiality and non-disparagement clauses, I replied. Then decide whether those restrictions are compatible with preventing potential harm to clients and consumers. And if they're not, then I'll have to decide what I value more, short-term financial security or long-term ethical integrity. Jonathan nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. Whatever you choose, Sophia, know that you have allies who share your concerns. You're not standing alone. As we prepared to leave, Jonathan using a side exit while I departed through the front, he added one final thought. Marcus sees your meticulous nature as an outdated approach in a world that values speed above all else. What he fails to understand is that precision and thoroughness aren't liabilities in technology. They're the foundation of systems that actually work. His words resonated deeply, articulating something I had intuitively understood throughout my career. In a discipline where a single misplaced character could crash an entire system, attention to detail wasn't an optional personality trait. It was an essential professional skill. I returned to my apartment by another circuitous route, my mind processing the additional context Jonathan had provided. The picture that emerged was increasingly troubling, not merely aggressive cost-cutting or timeline acceleration, but a systematic dismantling of the governance structures and security protocols that had made Vertex a trusted partner for financial institutions worldwide. Back at my dining table, I opened my laptop and found an email from Brandon Davis, sent to my personal account as requested. Need to talk. Helios integration documentation has major gaps. Financial module passing quality. Gates despite failed security tests. Something doesn't add up. So Brandon had already begun noticing the discrepancies. His technical skills were excellent, even if his institutional knowledge was limited. The question was whether he understood the significance of what he was observing, and whether he knew the professional risk he was taking by questioning it. I responded carefully. Proceed with caution. Document everything. Use personal channels only. Next, I turned my attention to the severance agreement, reading every clause with the meticulous attention I had applied to software specifications throughout my career. The legal language was deliberately intimidating, filled with broad prohibitions against disparagement, disclosure of confidential information, and interference with company relationships. Most concerning was a clause requiring me to certify that I was unaware of any violations of law, regulation, or company policy during my employment. A blanket statement that would effectively prevent me from later reporting the security and compliance issues I had documented. I opened a fresh document and began drafting a response to the severance offer, carefully outlining specific concerns with the proposed agreement, while neither accepting nor explicitly rejecting the offer. This would buy additional time while I developed a more comprehensive strategy. My phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Walker? This is Elizabeth Carver. Jonathan suggested I contact you regarding a matter of potential regulatory concern. Available to meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. if convenient. Jonathan had moved quickly. The involvement of a state financial regulator raised both the stakes and the possibilities. With proper regulatory engagement, the security issues might be addressed without necessarily destroying Vertex in the process, precisely the outcome I hoped for. I confirmed the meeting and then turned back to my notebooks, focusing on the specific technical modifications to the Helios platform that had compromised its security architecture. The details mattered, not just what had been changed, but how. Those changes would affect real-world financial transactions processing billions of dollars daily. As evening approached, I received another text from Brandon. Chen called emergency meeting, accelerating Helios launch by 2 weeks. Compliance checks being streamlined further. Need your guidance. The acceleration was alarming, but not surprising. Marcus likely sensed potential resistance and was moving to establish facts on the ground before questions could gain traction. By launching earlier, with my replacement still struggling to understand the complex system architecture, he could present any subsequent problems as implementation issues rather than fundamental design flaws. Document everything, I texted back, especially written directives to bypass standard protocols. Forward to personal email. Stay professional in all meetings. I hesitated before adding, your professional reputation will outlast any single project or company. Remember that when pressure mounts. It was the same advice Jonathan had given me early in my career when I had faced pressure to certify a product component that wasn't fully tested. That guidance had shaped my professional ethics and given me the courage to maintain standards, even when doing so was uncomfortable or inconvenient. As night fell over the city, I stood at my window looking toward the Vertex headquarters building, its upper floors still illuminated with weekend workers preparing for the accelerated launch. The people there, developers, testers, project managers, were former colleagues who trusted that their leadership was making sound decisions. Most had no way of knowing that the system they were racing to complete had been compromised in ways that might eventually harm the very customers it was meant to serve. My termination had been presented as a routine corporate reorganization, my skills deemed outdated in the rapidly evolving technology landscape. But as I reviewed the evidence and connected the disparate elements of Marcus Chen's strategy, a different truth emerged. My methodical approach and institutional knowledge weren't liabilities because they were inefficient. They were threats because they created accountability. The path forward was becoming clearer, though not easier. The meeting with Elizabeth Carver tomorrow would be pivotal, an opportunity to ensure that proper regulatory oversight was applied before potentially compromised financial systems went live. Tomorrow would bring difficult choices with significant consequences. But tonight had brought something equally important: clarity of purpose and the confirmation that I wasn't standing alone against a powerful corporate machine. I had allies who shared my concerns, documentation that supported my observations, and most importantly, the absolute conviction that preventing harm was worth whatever professional price I might ultimately pay. Being called outdated had initially stung, carrying the weight of age bias and professional dismissal. But perhaps being outdated simply meant remembering the fundamental principles that had made good technology good in the first place. Security before speed, quality before quarterly. Results and ultimately people before profit. Those principles weren't outdated. They were timeless, and I was prepared to defend them. Sunday morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that sometimes follows difficult realizations. I woke at 5:30 a.m. without an alarm, my mind already processing the day ahead and the critical meeting with Elizabeth Carver. The early hour afforded me valuable preparation time, allowing for methodical organization of the evidence I had compiled. After a light breakfast and strong coffee, I cleared my dining table and arranged my documentation chronologically. First came the original Helios platform security specifications that my team had designed, a robust architecture with multiple redundant safeguards appropriate for financial data processing. Next, I assembled the series of modifications that had been implemented over the past 4 months, each seemingly minor when viewed in isolation, but collectively amounting to a systematic degradation of security protocols. Most critically, I gathered evidence showing that these modifications hadn't been properly communicated to clients or noted in official documentation. The financial institutions preparing to implement Vertex's software would be doing so with a fundamental misunderstanding of its actual security capabilities. Preparing for the meeting with Elizabeth Carver required careful consideration of regulatory perspectives. Financial technology regulations balanced competing priorities, encouraging innovation while protecting system integrity, promoting efficiency while ensuring security. The most effective approach would focus on preventative correction rather than punitive enforcement, identifying problems before they caused harm and implementing appropriate safeguards. At 11:30 a.m., my preparation was interrupted by a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Sophia Walker? A woman's voice, precise and professional. Speaking. This is Elizabeth Carver. I'm afraid I need to reschedule our meeting for today. Would 11 a.m. at the Westfield Public Library work for you? Second floor conference room. The change in time and location was unexpected, but not necessarily concerning. Public officials often maintained flexible schedules, particularly when handling sensitive matters. That would be fine, I confirmed. I'll be there. Bring whatever documentation you consider relevant. And Ms. Walker, she paused briefly. It would be prudent to avoid company or personal devices that might be monitored. This final caution confirmed my impression that Elizabeth Carver understood the sensitivity of the situation. Her suggestion to avoid potentially monitored devices aligned with my own security precautions. Understood, I replied simply. I adjusted my schedule accordingly, gathering the most critical documentation into a traditional paper folder rather than digital formats. The approach felt almost anachronistic in the digital age, precisely why it offered a certain security. Digital files could be monitored, tracked, and remotely accessed. Physical documents required physical presence to view. At 10:30 a.m., I left my apartment and took a circuitous route to the library, using public transportation and making several unnecessary transfers to identify potential surveillance. The precautions might seem excessive, but 15 years in technology had taught me that digital privacy was increasingly illusory, particularly when corporate interests were at stake. The Westfield Public Library occupied a century-old sandstone building that had been internally modernized while preserving its historical character. I climbed the marble staircase to the second floor, following signs to the conference rooms. Elizabeth Carver was already waiting, seated at a polished oak table with a leather portfolio open before her. She rose as I entered, a tall woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked dark hair and the composed demeanor of someone accustomed to handling sensitive information. Her handshake was firm, her assessment direct, but not unfriendly. Ms. Walker, thank you for meeting on short notice. Thank you for your interest in this matter, I replied, taking the seat across from her. Jonathan Ward speaks highly of you, she noted, which carries significant weight in my assessment. Before we begin, I should clarify my position and authority. She provided a concise overview of her role with the State Financial Services, Regulatory Commission, particularly her oversight of technology implementations affecting state-chartered financial institutions. Her background included 15 years with federal agencies focused on cybersecurity before transitioning to state-level regulation. My primary concern is preventing systemic vulnerabilities rather than pursuing enforcement actions, she explained, though the latter remains available when necessary. This approach aligned perfectly with my objectives, addressing the security issues before they caused harm, rather than punishing Vertex after damage occurred. I appreciate that perspective, I replied. My goal isn't to damage Vertex Technologies, but to ensure its systems meet the security standards that clients and consumers deserve. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. Then we have aligned interests. Please outline your concerns. For the next 45 minutes, I methodically presented the documentation I had gathered, explaining the technical specifications in terms accessible to someone with regulatory rather than development expertise. I detailed the original security, architecture, the subsequent modifications, and most importantly, the discrepancies between what clients had been promised and what would actually be delivered. Elizabeth took meticulous notes, occasionally asking precise questions that demonstrated her technical understanding. She paid particular attention to the timeline of changes following Marcus Chen's appointment as CEO and the correlation with personnel departures from security-focused positions. These modifications create three primary vulnerabilities, I concluded. First, the reduced encryption protocol leaves transaction data potentially accessible during cloud processing. Second, the abbreviated authentication sequence creates opportunities for session hijacking. And third, the modified API endpoints lack the intrusion detection capabilities specified in client contracts. Elizabeth reviewed her notes thoughtfully. In your professional assessment, what is the likelihood of these vulnerabilities being exploited if the system launches as currently configured? Impossible to quantify precisely, I admitted, maintaining the factual accuracy that had characterized my career. But based on historical patterns in financial technology breaches, systems with comparable vulnerabilities typically experience exploitation within the first 90 days of deployment. And the potential scope of compromise if exploitation occurs? Worst-case scenario would be unauthorized access to transaction data across multiple financial institutions simultaneously, I explained. Given the current client implementation schedule, that could potentially affect several million consumer accounts. Elizabeth closed her notebook, her expression grave but composed. This warrants immediate attention. I'll need two things from you. First, a formal written statement detailing these concerns that I can reference in official communications. Second, your availability for potential follow-up questions as we initiate our review. I'm prepared to provide both, I confirmed. You should understand the potential consequences, she added. Vertex will likely identify you as the source of this information. The severance agreement you mentioned would be voided. There could be legal challenges regarding confidentiality. I understand the risks, I acknowledged, but the potential harm to consumers from compromised financial data outweighs my personal considerations. Elizabeth studied me for a moment before nodding with apparent respect. Jonathan said you prioritized integrity over expediency. He was correct. She gathered her materials efficiently. I'll initiate a formal security review tomorrow morning. Vertex will be required to provide complete documentation of all modifications to the original security architecture, with certification of client notification regarding any substantive changes. This was precisely the intervention I had hoped for: focused, appropriately scaled, and potentially effective in preventing harm without unnecessarily damaging Vertex itself. How quickly can the review be completed? I asked. Expedited reviews typically require 7 to 10 business days, she replied. Given the impending launch timeline you've described, I'll prioritize this matter. You mentioned the accelerated launch is now scheduled for 3 weeks from tomorrow, I confirmed. moved forward from the original 5-week timeline. Elizabeth made a final note. That acceleration itself raises concerns about proper testing protocols. I'll include testing verification in our review requirements. As our meeting concluded, Elizabeth provided contact information for secure communications and confirmed receipt of my documentation. Your professional diligence may have prevented significant harm, she noted. Regardless of how Vertex leadership responds, you've fulfilled the highest obligation of your profession, protecting those who rely on your systems. Her validation provided unexpected relief, confirmation from a respected authority that my concerns were legitimate and my actions appropriate. The path ahead remained challenging, but I now had an established channel for ensuring proper oversight of Vertex's security implementations. After leaving the library, I found a message from Brandon Davis on my personal email. Urgent. Security modifications being implemented without proper documentation. Team being told to patch documentation. Later. Need guidance. The situation at Vertex was deteriorating faster than anticipated. Marcus Chen appeared to be accelerating implementation, while simultaneously reducing transparency, a concerning combination that suggested awareness that his approaches might not withstand scrutiny. I considered my response carefully. Brandon was taking significant professional risk by contacting me, potentially jeopardizing his position if discovered. However, his technical expertise made him a crucial internal ally for identifying and potentially mitigating the most concerning security compromises. Document everything, I replied. Focus particularly on changes to encryption protocols and authentication sequences. Keep records on personal devices. Consider your professional boundaries carefully. I deliberately avoided explicitly directing him to take any specific action that might violate his employment obligations while providing guidance that would help him protect himself professionally if the situation deteriorated further. By the time I returned to my apartment, another message had arrived, this one from Jonathan Ward. Board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Unusual timing suggests significant decisions pending. Will update when possible. An emergency board. Meeting on Monday morning, following directly after my termination on Thursday, suggested accelerating timelines beyond even what I had anticipated. Marcus Chen appeared to be consolidating authority and eliminating potential obstacles with remarkable speed. I spent the remainder of Sunday preparing my formal statement for Elizabeth Carver, carefully balancing technical detail with regulatory relevance. The document needed to be comprehensive enough to justify intervention while focused enough to enable prompt action. I included references to specific regulatory requirements that the modified system would potentially violate, particularly regarding data security and client notification obligations. As evening approached, I received an unexpected email from Naomi Wells, Vertex's head of human resources. Ms. Walker, as we haven't received your signed severance agreement, I wanted to confirm your intentions regarding our offer. The terms are time-sensitive, with the proposed package available only until noon tomorrow. Please advise if you require any clarification of the terms. The timing wasn't coincidental. One final attempt to secure my silence before the board. Meeting tomorrow. The severance package represented significant immediate financial security, offering 3 months' salary and healthcare continuation in exchange for comprehensive non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements. The decision crystallized with unexpected clarity. I would not be signing. Whatever financial security the package offered paled in comparison to the professional and ethical implications of accepting constraints on my ability to address legitimate security concerns. I drafted a measured response. Ms. Wells, thank you for following up. After careful review of the proposed agreement, I find I cannot accept the terms as presented, particularly regarding the certifications required in Section 7. I remain open to discussing a modified agreement that better balances the company's interests with my professional obligations. Regards, Sophia Walker. The reference to Section 7, the clause requiring me to certify no knowledge of regulatory violations, would signal to any competent legal professional that I had identified potentially problematic issues. The message was intentionally calibrated, not explicitly threatening, but clearly indicating awareness of matters that might warrant further examination. Minutes after sending my response, I received a text from Brandon. Chen called another emergency meeting. Entire development team. Required to sign new confidentiality agreements specifically covering Helios implementation details. Something's happening. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Marcus Chen was systematically eliminating potential sources of information about the Helios platform's security modifications. First, my termination. Now, additional confidentiality requirements for the development team, all coinciding with an emergency board meeting. The acceleration suggested not merely aggressive business practices, but active concern about potential discovery. I forwarded Brandon's message to Elizabeth Carver with a brief note. FYI, Vertex appears to be implementing additional confidentiality measures specifically regarding Helios security details. Timing suggests awareness of potential regulatory interest. Her response came quickly. Noted. Have accelerated review initiation to tomorrow morning. Will request immediate documentation access under Section 1042 authority. This escalation represented a significant development. Section 1042 authorized state regulators to require immediate production of technical documentation when potential consumer financial harm might be imminent. The provision was rarely invoked but carried substantial compliance requirements for financial technology providers. As Sunday evening progressed, the pieces began aligning with unexpected rapidity. Jonathan sent another brief update. Yamamoto requesting full technical review before board vote tomorrow. Chen resistant but outmaneuvered by procedural requirement. Opportunity emerging. Dr. Yamamoto's intervention represented a potential inflection point. As the board's most technically knowledgeable member, his request for comprehensive review carried weight that even Marcus Chen would struggle to dismiss entirely. Combined with Elizabeth Carver's regulatory intervention scheduled for tomorrow morning, the situation was evolving toward potential accountability before implementation rather than aftermath. Just before midnight, a final message arrived from Brandon. Found something you should see. Original security architecture approvals modified in documentation system. Timestamps altered. Have preserved original versions through system backup. This crosses line from concerning to potentially illegal. The falsification of approval documentation represented a significant escalation, moving from aggressive timeline acceleration and security compromise into potential fraud. If financial clients were making implementation decisions based on falsified approval documentation, the implications extended beyond regulatory concerns into potential criminal liability. I forwarded this information to Elizabeth Carver with appropriate context, and then composed a careful email to Dr. Yamamoto, whom I had worked with periodically during his technical reviews. The message didn't explicitly reveal Brandon's discovery, but encouraged thorough examination of implementation documentation timestamps during tomorrow's review. Sleep proved elusive that night as I considered the rapidly evolving situation. What had begun as my personal professional setback was transforming into something with far broader implications. Potential systemic financial security vulnerabilities affecting millions of consumers, deliberately concealed through increasingly concerning methods. Monday morning arrived with unexpected developments. At 7:15 a.m., Jonathan called rather than texted, a departure from his previous careful communications. Sophia, I've just received word from Yamamoto. Chen attempted to cancel the technical review by claiming emergency client priorities, but 3 board members insisted it proceed as scheduled. The review begins at 9 a.m. Will they have access to the complete documentation? I asked, recognizing that selective presentation could easily obscure the most problematic modifications. Yamamoto has requested unrestricted access to the full development repository, Jonathan confirmed, Chen objected, but was overruled when Yamamoto cited fiduciary responsibility requirements. This represented a significant procedural victory. With full repository access, the board's technical review would likely identify the security compromises and, potentially, the documentation alterations Brandon had discovered. "There's more," Jonathan continued. "Elizabeth Carver has already contacted Vertex's general counsel this morning, invoking regulatory review authority and requesting immediate access to Helios security architecture documentation. The timing caught them completely unprepared." The convergence of internal and external scrutiny created powerful momentum toward transparency. Marcus Chen was now facing coordinated challenges from both governance and regulatory directions, simultaneously. "How do you expect Chen to respond?" I asked, recognizing that cornered executives often took desperate measures to maintain control. "He'll attempt to compartmentalize and delay," Jonathan assessed. "Provide minimum documentation to regulators while arguing for limited board oversight based on competitive sensitivity. Standard tactics when trying to prevent comprehensive review." Jonathan's prediction proved remarkably accurate. By 10:30 a.m., Brandon reported that the development team had been instructed to prepare overview documentation only for regulatory submission, with Marcus personally reviewing all materials before release. Simultaneously, Elizabeth Carver updated me on Vertex's initial response to her inquiry, a formal letter asserting that the requested documentation required appropriate redaction to protect proprietary methodologies before submission, a transparent attempt to delay comprehensive review. The simultaneous resistance on both fronts confirmed what I had increasingly suspected. The security compromises weren't merely aggressive shortcuts, but deliberate decisions with full awareness of their implications. Marcus Chen appeared willing to risk significant security vulnerabilities to achieve accelerated market positioning, presumably to demonstrate rapid results that would enhance his personal reputation and compensation regardless of long-term consequences. At 11:45 a.m., just 15 minutes before my severance agreement deadline, I received another email from Naomi Wells. "Ms. Walker, I've been instructed to extend the severance agreement deadline until 5 p.m. today, with a modified agreement attached for your consideration. The updated terms include increased compensation and expanded healthcare coverage. Please review at your earliest convenience." The timing was revealing, clearly a response to mounting pressures from both the board review and regulatory inquiry. The modified agreement Jonathan had forwarded included a significant increase in financial terms, 6 months' salary rather than 3, extended healthcare coverage, and accelerated vesting of a portion of my stock options. However, the expanded confidentiality provisions were even more restrictive, explicitly prohibiting any communication with regulatory authorities regarding Vertex Technologies without prior written approval from company legal counsel. The increased offer confirmed my leverage while simultaneously revealing Vertex leadership's priorities. They were willing to pay significantly more for guaranteed silence, particularly regarding regulatory matters. I drafted a carefully worded response. "Ms. Wells, thank you for the modified offer. While the improved financial terms are appreciated, the expanded confidentiality provisions in Section 12 appear to potentially conflict with established regulatory compliance obligations. I would request legal clarification of these terms before proceeding further. Regards, Sophia Walker." The response was calculated to buy additional time while signaling continued awareness of regulatory considerations, a subtle reminder that aggressive confidentiality provisions might themselves raise regulatory concerns. At 12:30 p.m., the situation accelerated dramatically. Brandon called my personal phone directly, a significant escalation from our previous text-based communications. "Sophia, I need your advice urgently," he began, his voice tense. "The board technical review has identified the security architecture modifications Dr. Yamamoto is asking pointed questions about approval documentation and client notification. Chen just instructed the team to prepare updated documentation, showing these changes were always part of the planned implementation. This crosses every ethical line I can imagine. This represented a pivotal moment for Brandon, being explicitly instructed to falsify documentation for board review pushed him from concerned observer to potential participant in misrepresentation. "What are you considering?" I asked carefully, recognizing the weight of his professional and ethical dilemma. "I'm thinking about addressing the board directly," he replied. "Yamamoto has scheduled individual meetings with key technical staff this afternoon. I could provide accurate information about the actual implementation timeline and approval process." The professional risk for Brandon was substantial: potential termination at minimum, possible legal challenges regarding confidentiality, at worst. Yet the ethical implications of remaining silent were equally significant. "I can't tell you what decision to make," I responded truthfully. "But I can share what guided my own choices. Our work affects millions of people who trust our systems to protect their financial security. That trust creates obligations that sometimes transcend organizational loyalty." Brandon was silent for a moment before responding with new resolution. "I'm meeting with Yamamoto at 2 p.m. I'll provide accurate information and documentation of the actual development timeline. Whatever happens afterward, I'll know I did the right thing." His decision represented a crucial inflection point in the unfolding situation. A second knowledgeable insider willing to prioritize integrity over expediency, despite significant personal risk. The afternoon brought cascading developments. At 2:45 p.m., Elizabeth Carver called with an update. "We've received initial documentation from Vertex, but it's clearly incomplete and potentially misleading. I've elevated this to an urgent priority review and issued a formal demand for complete unredacted documentation by close of business today." Their initial response raises significant concerns about transparency and compliance readiness. At 3:30 p.m., Jonathan reported that the board technical review had extended beyond its scheduled conclusion, with Dr. Yamamoto requesting additional development team interviews following his session with Brandon. The board meeting originally scheduled to approve the accelerated Helios launch had been postponed pending completion of the expanded technical assessment. By 4:15 p.m., the situation had reached a critical threshold. Brandon texted from inside Vertex headquarters. "Board review has expanded to include full executive committee. Chen trying to control narrative, but Yamamoto has original documentation from repository backups. Original versus modified security specifications being displayed. Side by side. Financial clients being contacted about potential implementation delay pending additional security verification." The convergence of internal governance and external regulatory scrutiny had created unstoppable momentum toward transparency and accountability. The carefully constructed narrative of accelerated innovation was giving way to the reality of compromised security and questionable documentation practices. At 5 p.m., as my extended severance deadline expired unsigned, Naomi Wells sent a final message. "Ms. Walker, please be advised that the severance offer has been withdrawn pending resolution of matters currently under review. The company reserves all rights regarding confidentiality obligations applicable to your previous employment." The tone shift was revealing, from incentivized cooperation to implicit threat, reflecting the rapidly deteriorating position of those who had orchestrated my termination. Their leverage had evaporated as their actions became subject to multi-layered scrutiny. As Monday evening approached, the situation at Vertex continued evolving rapidly. Jonathan provided periodic updates from his board contacts. The technical review had expanded into a comprehensive security assessment. The accelerated launch had been officially delayed pending additional quality verification, and most significantly, an emergency executive session had been called to discuss leadership concerns arising from the technical review findings. Brandon remained inside Vertex headquarters, providing crucial factual information to board members conducting the expanded review. His professional courage in prioritizing accuracy over expediency represented exactly the ethical standard that had characterized Vertex under Jonathan's leadership, a standard that had been systematically undermined during Marcus Chen's brief tenure. By 8:30 p.m., Elizabeth Carver confirmed that her regulatory team had received complete technical documentation following her escalated demands, and a formal security assessment was underway, with results expected within 48 hours. The day's developments had transformed the landscape completely. What began as my individual professional setback had catalyzed a full system correction: board governance, reasserting appropriate oversight, regulatory mechanisms engaging effectively, and individual professionals choosing integrity over expedient. Compliance. As I reviewed the day's events from my dining table, still covered with the documentation that had initiated this cascade, I recognized that this outcome represented something more significant than personal vindication. It demonstrated that systems of accountability could function effectively when knowledgeable individuals chose to prioritize professional integrity over personal interest. My termination had been presented as a routine corporate decision, my methodical approach deemed outdated in an environment that prioritized speed over substance. Yet that same methodical approach, the careful documentation, the systematic analysis, the principled assessment, had ultimately revealed critically important patterns that might otherwise have remained obscured until significant harm occurred. The day's events confirmed something I had always believed but rarely seen demonstrated so clearly. In technology, thoroughness wasn't an obsolete virtue, but an essential discipline. Systems that controlled financial data affecting millions of lives demanded meticulous attention rather than expedient approximation. Being called outdated for maintaining those standards wasn't an insult, but a profound misunderstanding of what made technology trustworthy in the first place. Tomorrow would bring new developments and challenges, but tonight had provided confirmation that standing firmly for professional principles, even at personal cost, remained the foundation of meaningful contribution in a field where integrity and precision determined whether systems served people properly or failed them catastrophically. Sometimes being outdated simply meant remembering fundamental values that never actually expired. Tuesday morning arrived with the strange quietness that often accompanies significant transitions. I woke early after a night of intermittent sleep, my mind processing the rapid developments of the previous day while anticipating what might come next. The familiar routine of preparing for work, a routine that had structured my weekdays for 15 years, had been abruptly terminated, yet I found myself more professionally engaged than ever. My phone displayed several notifications that had arrived overnight. The first was from Jonathan Ward, time-stamped 11:42 p.m. Emergency board session concluded. Executive committee established to review leadership alignment with company values and governance standards. Chen temporarily divested of product approval authority pending review completion. Yamamoto heading technical assessment team with unrestricted access. This represented a significant shift in authority, the board reasserting governance control by effectively limiting Marcus Chen's decision-making power regarding the Helios platform. Dr. Yamamoto's leadership of the technical assessment ensured that someone with genuine understanding would evaluate the security modifications rather than merely accepting executive assurances. The second message was from Brandon, sent at 1:15 a.m. Finally home. Board review expanded to full security audit of all Helios components. Chen tried to characterize modifications as routine optimizations, but documentation trail proved otherwise. Yamamoto requested my continued involvement in review process. Meeting again at 8 a.m. Brandon's continued participation in the review process was crucial. His detailed knowledge of the current implementation would help identify precisely which components had been compromised and how they might be properly restored. His willingness to provide accurate information despite personal risk had proven instrumental in establishing the factual foundation for board intervention. The third notification was an email from Elizabeth Carver, sent at 6:30 a.m. Ms. Walker, our preliminary assessment confirms your core concerns regarding the modified security architecture. We've identified multiple instances where implemented. Protocols differ materially from client documentation without appropriate disclosure. I've scheduled a call with Vertex's General Counsel and Compliance Officer for 9 a.m. to discuss immediate remediation requirements. Would value your technical input during this process if you're available. Her message confirmed that regulatory oversight was functioning as designed, identifying potential harm before implementation rather than responding to breaches after they occurred. The request for my continued involvement indicated recognition of my technical knowledge rather than dismissal of my perspective as outdated. I replied to Elizabeth confirming my availability for consultation, then prepared for what promised to be another day of significant developments. The rapid mobilization of both governance and regulatory responses suggested that the situation at Vertex was approaching a critical inflection point, the moment when temporary intervention might become permanent correction. At 10:15 a.m., Jonathan called with an update on the morning's developments. Sophia, the situation is evolving quickly. The board's executive committee met at 7 a.m. and has established a formal leadership review process. Marcus has been placed on administrative leave pending completion of the review. This was a significant escalation, moving from restricted authority to formal separation, albeit temporarily. What prompted the administrative leave? I asked, recognizing that boards typically preferred less disruptive interventions when possible. Yamamoto's technical team discovered that some of the documentation alterations weren't merely retrospective adjustments, but involved backdated approval signatures, Jonathan explained. When confronted with this evidence during this morning's executive session, Marcus attempted to shift responsibility to the development team leads. Brandon was able to produce original email directives proving otherwise. The attempted deflection of responsibility onto team members represented a particularly concerning ethical breach, sacrificing subordinates to protect executive decisions. Brandon's foresight in preserving original communications had proven crucial in establishing the actual chain of accountability. The board has named Patricia Hernandez as acting CEO, Jonathan continued, referring to Vertex's long-serving chief operating officer. She's been instructed to ensure full cooperation with both the internal assessment and regulatory review. Patricia was a 20-year Vertex veteran who had risen through operations management rather than technology development. Her expertise lay in process implementation rather than product innovation, precisely the perspective needed to address procedural failures that had enabled security compromises. And the Helios platform? I asked, concerned about the project itself beyond the leadership issues. Launch officially delayed by minimum 60 days, Jonathan confirmed. Full security architecture reassessment ordered with instruction to prioritize original specifications over timeline considerations. This represented exactly the reset needed, refocusing on security fundamentals rather than arbitrary market timing. The delay would create short-term marketplace challenges, but potentially prevent catastrophic long-term consequences from compromised financial systems. Helios can be salvaged, I noted, recognizing the importance of preserving the platform's innovative components while addressing its security deficiencies. The core architecture remains sound if the compromised components are properly restored. The board recognizes that, Jonathan agreed. Which leads to something else I need to discuss with you. Patricia has requested authorization to contact you regarding potential consulting during the restoration process. Your knowledge of the original architecture would be valuable in ensuring proper implementation. The invitation represented a remarkable reversal, from terminated employee deemed outdated to requested expert consultant within the span of 5 days. The irony wasn't lost on me, though vindication wasn't my primary objective. My priority remains ensuring the system meets appropriate security standards before deployment, I replied. If consulting helps achieve that outcome, I'm open to the possibility. I thought you might say that, Jonathan observed. Patricia will likely reach out later today once the board formally approves the arrangement. The morning continued, with rapid developments. Elizabeth Carver called at 11:30 a.m. to provide an update on the regulatory intervention. I've just concluded the call with Vertex's legal and compliance teams, she began. They've acknowledged the documentation discrepancies and agreed to implement a supervised remediation plan with weekly progress verification. How did they explain the discrepancies? I asked, curious about the institutional narrative emerging. To account for the systematic security compromises. Their current position attributes the issues to communication failures during leadership transition, Elizabeth replied, her tone suggesting professional skepticism. They're carefully avoiding admissions that might create liability while committing to comprehensive correction moving forward. This represented a predictable corporate approach, acknowledging problems without accepting accountability, positioning systemic issues as isolated communication failures rather than deliberate decisions. However, the commitment to supervised remediation with verification protocols would ensure actual correction regardless of the face-saving narrative. The important outcome is proper security implementation before deployment, I noted, focusing on practical results rather than attribution. Precisely, Elizabeth agreed. Though our findings will be documented in the official assessment, including the pattern of modifications following leadership changes. Regulatory records have long memories, Ms. Walker. Her comment highlighted an important regulatory reality often overlooked by executives focused on quarterly metrics. Agencies maintained comprehensive historical records that informed future oversight. Companies that demonstrated patterns of concerning behavior received appropriately heightened scrutiny even after addressing specific incidents. At 1:15 p.m., Brandon texted from inside Vertex headquarters. Technical review expanding beyond Helios to all recent product modifications. Development team speaking freely now about other corners cut in recent months. Chen supporters in management becoming notably scarce today. The expanding assessment suggested that the security compromises in Helios might represent a broader pattern of degraded standards following Marcus Chen's appointment, potentially affecting multiple product lines rather than a single platform. The cultural shift Brandon described, team members speaking openly about previously suppressed concerns, indicated how quickly organizational behavior could change when leadership priorities shifted. By mid-afternoon, the situation at Vertex had become public. Technology industry publications ran headlines about leadership transition and product launch delays at Vertex Technologies, with financial analysts speculating about potential impacts on quarterly results. The company's stock price had dropped 8% by closing bell, reflecting market uncertainty about the unexpected developments. At 4:30 p.m., I received a call from Patricia Hernandez, Vertex's acting CEO. Ms. Walker, thank you for taking my call, she began with characteristic directness. I'll be straightforward. We need your expertise to properly restore the Helios security architecture. The board has authorized me to offer a 6-month consulting arrangement with considerable flexibility regarding terms. Her approach, practical, transparent, and focused on problem-solving rather than face-saving, represented exactly the leadership style needed to address the current situation. Patricia had always been known for operational effectiveness rather than political maneuvering. I appreciate the offer, Patricia, I replied. My primary concern remains ensuring proper security implementation before deployment. If my involvement helps achieve that outcome, I'm willing to consider appropriate arrangements. That's exactly the perspective we need, she confirmed. This situation has revealed significant gaps in our governance processes. The technical issues can be corrected relatively quickly, but the underlying procedural failures require more fundamental reassessment. This acknowledgement of systemic, rather than merely technical issues, represented an important recognition that the current crisis reflected governance failures beyond simple coding decisions. The security compromises had been enabled by weakened oversight, altered approval processes, and diminished accountability. The board has established a comprehensive governance review committee, Patricia continued. They've specifically requested your participation given your historical knowledge of our development protocols and recent observations of their degradation. The invitation to contribute to governance reconstruction rather than merely technical restoration reflected recognition of my broader organizational understanding, exactly the comprehensive perspective that Marcus Chen had dismissed as outdated when focused exclusively on accelerated timelines. We discussed preliminary terms for a consulting arrangement that would include both technical guidance for Helios restoration and advisory input on governance reconstruction. The proposed compensation was significant, considerably more than my previous salary, but the more meaningful aspect was the explicit value placed on institutional knowledge and systematic thinking. We need to rebuild trust, Patricia acknowledged toward the end of our conversation, not just with clients and regulators, but with our own team members who raised concerns that weren't appropriately addressed. Your involvement would send an important signal about the values we're recommitting to. The framework we established would allow me to maintain independence while providing crucial guidance during Vertex's recovery process. I would participate in the Helios Restoration Project and Governance Committee as an external advisor rather than rejoining as an employee, maintaining appropriate separation to ensure objective assessment. By Tuesday evening, the situation had stabilized into a clear direction forward. The Helios platform would undergo comprehensive security restoration with regulatory oversight. Vertex's governance processes would be systematically reconstructed, with board supervision, and Marcus Chen's leadership would be formally evaluated against established corporate standards rather than merely short-term metrics. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone chimed with one final message from Naomi Wells, the HR director who had participated in my termination meeting just 5 days earlier. Ms. Walker, I've been instructed to contact you regarding the formal consulting agreement discussed with Patricia Hernandez. Additionally, the board has authorized me to offer restoration of your stock options with immediate vesting as a gesture of organizational good faith. Please let me know when you might be available to discuss these arrangements. The message represented the final confirmation of shifting organizational priorities, from terminating my employment days before stock option vesting to offering immediate vesting as part of rebuilding institutional relationships. While personally beneficial, the reversal mattered less for its financial implications than for what it revealed about renewed organizational values. Wednesday morning brought the first indications of how Vertex would publicly address the situation. The company issued a press release announcing a strategic reassessment of the Helios platform launch timeline to ensure alignment with Vertex's industry-leading security standards. The statement included quotes from Patricia Hernandez about recommitting to the foundational values that have defined Vertex's approach to financial technology. The carefully crafted language avoided explicit acknowledgement of previous security compromises while clearly signaling a return to prioritizing security over speed. Financial analysts responded with cautious optimism, noting that while the delay would affect quarterly results, the recommitment to security standards would preserve long-term client relationships. By mid-morning, I had received the formal consulting agreement from Vertex's legal department. The terms aligned with our discussion: 6 months of technical and governance advisory services with appropriate compensation and explicit protection for independent assessment. Most notably, the agreement contained no restrictive confidentiality provisions beyond standard client privacy protections, a stark contrast to the aggressive silencing mechanisms in the rejected severance agreement. I signed the agreement, and returned it by secure electronic delivery, officially transitioning from terminated employee to engaged consultant within the span of 6 days. My first official meeting as Vertex consultant was scheduled for Thursday morning, a comprehensive, technical review of the Helios security architecture with Brandon, Dr. Yamamoto, and the restoration team. The objective was establishing a clear roadmap for returning to the original security specifications while maintaining the platform's innovative functional capabilities. Wednesday afternoon brought notification of another significant development. Marcus Chen had resigned as CEO of Vertex Technologies, effective immediately. The board's press release thanked him for his contributions during a transitional period, while announcing the formation of a CEO search committee headed by Dr. Yamamoto to identify leadership aligned with Vertex's core values of innovation, integrity, and client trust. The diplomatic phrasing didn't explicitly acknowledge the governance failures that had precipitated the change, but the emphasis on core values and Dr. Yamamoto's leadership of the search process sent a clear message about renewed priorities. The market responded positively, with Vertex stock recovering most of its previous day's losses by closing bell. Brandon called that evening with an update from inside Vertex headquarters. "The atmosphere has completely transformed," he reported. Teams are openly discussing security considerations that were previously dismissed as excessive caution. Patricia met with the entire product development division this afternoon and explicitly stated that no timeline considerations would supersede security requirements. This cultural reset represented perhaps the most important outcome of the crisis, re-establishing institutional values that prioritized fundamental quality over expedient delivery. Technical specifications could be restored relatively quickly, but rebuilding a culture of appropriate caution and professional integrity required consistent leadership reinforcement. "How are you being treated?" I asked, concerned about potential backlash against Brandon for his crucial role in exposing the documentation alterations. "Surprisingly well," he replied. Patricia publicly acknowledged the professional courage required to maintain accurate documentation during challenging transitions. Several executives who were closely aligned with Chen have voluntarily resigned, and their replacements are systematically reviewing recent decisions across all departments. The cascading leadership changes suggested comprehensive organizational correction rather than merely isolated intervention regarding Helios. The situation had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of Vertex's direction under Marcus Chen's brief tenure. Thursday morning found me returning to Vertex headquarters for the first time since my termination, this time entering through the main reception with an official visitor badge rather than being escorted out by security. The contrast wasn't lost on me, though it represented systemic correction rather than personal vindication. The technical review meeting was scheduled in the main conference room where, just 6 days earlier, I had been informed that my skills were outdated and my position eliminated. Now that same room held Brandon, Dr. Yamamoto, the core development team, and 2 representatives from the State Financial Services Regulatory Commission, a group assembled specifically to benefit from my perspective and expertise. Dr. Yamamoto opened the meeting with characteristic precision. "Our objective today is establishing a comprehensive restoration roadmap for the Helios security architecture. Ms. Walker's knowledge of the original specifications will be invaluable in identifying precisely which components require revision and in what sequence." For the next 3 hours, we methodically reviewed each security component, comparing original specifications with current implementation. The development team provided detailed status reports on modified elements, while the regulatory representatives offered perspective on compliance requirements for financial data processing systems. The collaborative process represented exactly the balanced approach that had characterized Vertex's most successful projects under Jonathan Ward's leadership. Technical innovation guided by appropriate governance, creative problem-solving constrained by security fundamentals. The work was challenging, but energizing. focused on constructive resolution rather than blame assignment. By meeting's end, we had established a clear restoration framework with prioritized components, defined validation, protocols, and appropriate regulatory checkpoints. The revised timeline projected full security restoration within 30 days, allowing for comprehensive testing before potential deployment consideration. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Yamamoto approached me privately. "Your contribution today was precisely what this organization needs," he noted. "The ability to maintain comprehensive system perspective while addressing specific technical challenges that's increasingly rare in our industry's rush toward specialization." His observation highlighted a fundamental misunderstanding in Marcus Chen's dismissal of my approach as outdated. What Chen had perceived as excessive caution was actually systematic thinking. The capacity to recognize how individual components interacted within complex systems and how seemingly minor modifications could create significant vulnerabilities through unintended consequences. Sometimes experience provides pattern recognition that can't be replaced by isolated expertise, I acknowledged. Precisely, Yamamoto agreed. The board recognizes that now, which is why I'd like to discuss another possibility with you, beyond the current consulting arrangement. He explained that the CEO search committee was considering a significant organizational restructuring, establishing a new executive position focused specifically on technical governance and system integrity. The role would function as a counterbalance to market-focused leadership, ensuring appropriate consideration of security, quality, and sustainability alongside growth and innovation. We believe this structural correction is necessary to prevent recurrence of the current situation, he explained. Technical considerations must have equal weight in executive decisions, not merely advisory input that can be disregarded for expedience. The proposed position, Chief Technical Integrity Officer, would report directly to the board rather than through the CEO, with explicit authority to require appropriate security and quality protocols, even when they affected launch timelines or development costs. The structure represented institutional recognition that proper governance required balanced consideration of multiple values, rather than exclusive focus on speed and growth. The committee would like you to consider this position once your consulting engagement concludes, Yamamoto continued. Your comprehensive understanding of our systems combined with your demonstrated commitment to appropriate standards makes you uniquely qualified. The invitation represented remarkable institutional learning, not merely correcting specific security compromises, but establishing structural safeguards against future governance failures. More personally, it reflected profound reassessment of exactly the qualities that Marcus Chen had dismissed as outdated just days earlier. As I left Vertex headquarters that afternoon, I passed the product development floor where teams were actively implementing the restoration framework we had established that morning. Through the glass walls, I could see engaged collaboration, animated technical discussions, and the focused energy of professionals recommitted to appropriate standards. After a period of compromised values, the site provided the most meaningful validation of all: confirmation that systems could be corrected, governance could be restored, and institutional values could be re-established when knowledgeable individuals chose to maintain professional integrity despite personal risk. The journey from terminated employee to valued advisor had taken just 1 week, but the transition represented something far more significant than personal career rehabilitation. It demonstrated that expertise, systematic thinking, and principled assessment remained essential in technology development, not outdated approaches to be discarded for expedience, but foundational disciplines that determined whether systems served people properly or exposed them to unnecessary risk. Marcus Chen had labeled my methodical perspective outdated in an environment that prioritized speed over substance. Yet that same methodical approach had ultimately revealed critical vulnerabilities, catalyzed necessary intervention, and guided effective restoration, proving through results rather than rhetoric that comprehensive understanding remained irreplaceable in creating trustworthy technology. The following weeks would bring significant work in rebuilding both technical systems and governance processes. The path wouldn't be simple or straightforward, requiring careful balance between innovation and security, between creativity and discipline. But the essential foundation had been re-established. Recognition that technology affecting millions of lives demanded meticulous attention rather than expedient approximation. As I walked through the plaza outside Vertex headquarters, I reflected on the extraordinary developments of the past week. What had begun as personal professional setback had catalyzed systemic correction with potentially far-reaching benefits, not just preventing specific security vulnerabilities, but re-establishing institutional values that would guide countless future decisions. The experience confirmed something I had always believed but rarely seen demonstrated so clearly. In technology, thoroughness wasn't an obsolete virtue, but an essential discipline. Being called outdated for maintaining appropriate standards wasn't an insult but a fundamental misunderstanding of what made technology trustworthy in the first place. Sometimes being outdated simply meant remembering essential principles that never actually expired, principles that determined whether technology served humanity properly or failed it catastrophically. And sometimes the most valuable expertise wasn't the newest methodology, but the comprehensive understanding that connected isolated details into meaningful patterns, revealing critical insights that specialized focus might never discover. The company that had dismissed me was now actively rebuilding itself around the very principles I had maintained, perhaps the most meaningful validation possible in a field where results ultimately mattered more than rhetoric. The crisis wasn't yet fully resolved, but the path to proper resolution had been clearly established through renewed commitment to enduring values rather than expedient compromises. The systems would be restored, the governance would be rebuilt. And the lesson would be institutionalized, that in technology, as in life, the most reliable path forward often required remembering fundamental principles rather than discarding them for momentary advantage. That wasn't being outdated. That was being timeless. 2 weeks into my consulting role at Vertex Technologies, patterns had emerged that revealed both how quickly an organization could correct course and how deeply problematic practices had penetrated during Marcus Chen's brief tenure. The Helios platform security restoration was progressing efficiently, with approximately 60% of the compromised components returned to original specifications under Brandon's capable leadership. The development team's morale had rebounded remarkably as professional standards once again received appropriate recognition and support. Patricia Hernandez was proving surprisingly effective as acting CEO, her operational focus perfectly suited for systematic reconstruction rather than visionary disruption. She had instituted daily executive briefings where technical considerations received equal priority to market positioning, a significant shift from the previous administration's relegation of security concerns to subsidiary status. The board's Governance Review Committee had begun a comprehensive assessment of Vertex's decision-making processes, focusing particularly on how technical objections had been systematically minimized during critical product approvals. Dr. Yamamoto was leading this effort with characteristic methodical precision, documenting both procedural failures and potential structural improvements to prevent future governance breakdowns. On this particular Thursday morning, I arrived at Vertex headquarters for the weekly security restoration review. The meeting had become a focal point for assessing progress, addressing emerging challenges, and ensuring appropriate regulatory communication. In addition to the core technical team, Elizabeth Carver had begun attending these sessions, providing valuable regulatory perspective while monitoring compliance with remediation requirements. As I walked through the product development floor toward the conference room, I noticed something unexpected. Developers had begun returning photos and personal items to their workspaces, small but significant evidence of renewed commitment to the organization. During Marcus Chen's tenure, personal expression had been discouraged as unprofessional, with minimalist conformity promoted as evidence of focus and efficiency. The returning personal touches symbolized cultural restoration alongside technical correction. Brandon greeted me at the conference room door, tablet in hand with the latest progress metrics. Security protocol restoration at 63% completion, he reported without preamble. Authentication sequencing fully restored, encryption implementation at 82%, and API endpoint protection frameworks re-established with enhanced monitoring capabilities. His direct, data-focused approach reflected the healthy balance we had established: professional collaboration without unnecessary hierarchical deference. Despite his relative youth and briefer tenure at Vertex, Brandon had demonstrated remarkable technical leadership during the crisis, earning genuine respect rather than merely occupying an organizational position. "Any unexpected challenges this week?" I asked, setting my materials on the conference table. "The transaction verification module is proving more complex than anticipated," he acknowledged. "The modified version eliminated 3 security checkpoints that interacted with legacy systems. Restoring them requires careful coordination with financial institution interfaces." This represented exactly the type of system interconnection that Marcus Chen had failed to appreciate: the reality that enterprise technology rarely existed in isolation, but depended on complex interactions across multiple platforms, often including legacy systems that couldn't simply be replaced or bypassed without creating dangerous vulnerabilities. The meeting began promptly at 9 a.m., with representatives from each technical discipline providing concise status updates. Elizabeth Carver listened attentively, occasionally asking precise questions about implementation details or timeline projections. Her presence had initially created tension among team members unaccustomed to regulatory oversight, but they had gradually recognized her focus on systemic protection rather than individual blame. "The restoration metrics are encouraging," Elizabeth noted as the technical briefings concluded, "particularly regarding the encryption implementation and authentication sequencing. However, I'd like to better understand the transaction verification challenges you've identified." Brandon provided a detailed explanation of how the modified system had eliminated verification checkpoints that validated transaction authenticity across institutional boundaries, a critical security function despite its minimal impact on processing. Speed. The current challenge involved restoring these checkpoints without disrupting existing financial institution interfaces that had been configured to expect the modified protocols. "This highlights a critical governance consideration," I observed. "Security modifications don't occur in isolation. They create ripple effects across interconnected systems. Proper protocol would have required notifying financial partners about these changes during implementation rather than discovering the discrepancies during restoration." Elizabeth nodded with professional appreciation of the observation. "This exemplifies why governance frameworks must include explicit communication requirements regarding security modifications. Technical changes that affect multi-institutional systems create shared vulnerabilities that each participant has a right to evaluate." The discussion continued with collaborative problem-solving regarding the transaction verification challenges, ultimately producing a phased restoration approach that would maintain system functionality while progressively re-establishing security checkpoints. The solution wasn't merely technical, but included a carefully structured communication plan for financial institution partners. As the meeting concluded, Patricia Hernandez arrived unexpectedly. Her presence at technical reviews was unusual given her numerous responsibilities as acting CEO. "I apologize for the interruption," she began, addressing the room with characteristic directness. "But we've received information that I believe requires immediate consideration by this group." She explained that a major financial technology publication was preparing an investigative article about security vulnerability concerns in Vertex's financial processing systems. While the publication had requested official comment from Vertex regarding specific allegations, It appeared they already possessed detailed information about the modified security architecture and its potential implications. The reporter has documents showing security modifications that weren't disclosed to financial clients, Patricia continued. They're asking for confirmation that these changes were implemented without appropriate notification to affected institutions. The room fell momentarily silent as the implications registered. Someone with inside knowledge had provided specific technical details to the media, information that went beyond general concerns to include actual implementation specifications. The potential reputational damage extended beyond Vertex to affect client financial institutions whose systems interconnected with the Helios platform. When is the publication deadline? Elizabeth asked, immediately focusing on practical considerations. Tomorrow afternoon, Patricia replied. They've given us 24 hours to provide official response before going to press. Brandon exchanged glances with several development team members before speaking. The technical details they have, how specific are they? Patricia consulted a tablet containing the media inquiry. They reference modified encryption protocols, abbreviated authentication sequencing, and eliminated transaction verification checkpoints. They specifically ask whether these modifications were properly documented in client technical specifications. The level of detail suggested access to internal development documentation rather than merely general knowledge about accelerated timelines. Someone with significant technical understanding had deliberately exposed the security compromises to public scrutiny. This presents both challenge and opportunity, I observed after careful consideration. Challenge in managing potential reputational impact, but opportunity to demonstrate transparent remediation and recommitment to appropriate standards. Elizabeth nodded in agreement. Regulatory experience suggests that public disclosure of properly addressed vulnerabilities typically causes less long-term damage than discovery of undisclosed issues after implementation. Transparency about both the problem and its comprehensive resolution can actually rebuild institutional credibility. This perspective helped shift the conversation from defensive damage control to strategic transparency, recognizing that attempting to minimize or obscure the security compromises would likely cause greater long-term harm than acknowledging them directly while demonstrating comprehensive correction. What response approach would you recommend? Patricia asked, looking primarily toward Elizabeth and me. 3 components, Elizabeth suggested without hesitation. First, factual. Acknowledgement of the identified issues without defensive qualification. Second, comprehensive outline of the remediation process already underway with specific completion metrics. Third, detailed description of governance improvements being implemented to prevent recurrence. I added another consideration. Include explicit recognition of the legitimate concerns this situation raised, validating the importance of transparency while emphasizing the constructive institutional response. The focus should be restoration of appropriate standards rather than assignment of individual responsibility. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. That aligns with the board's perspective as well. Dr. Yamamoto specifically recommended against attempting to minimize the situation or deflect responsibility. This approach represented remarkable institutional maturity, choosing substantive accountability over superficial image management, prioritizing genuine correction over perception manipulation. It reflected the fundamental values that had characterized Vertex under Jonathan Ward's leadership, temporarily obscured during Marcus Chen's tenure, but now re-emerging as guiding principles. Patricia, Elizabeth, Brandon, and I spent the next 2 hours drafting a comprehensive response framework, carefully balancing technical accuracy with accessible explanation, institutional accountability with forward-looking correction. The final document acknowledged the security modifications without equivocation, detailed the restoration process with specific metrics and regulatory oversight, and outlined the governance improvements being implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. This level of transparency carries certain risks, Patricia noted as we reviewed the completed framework. Competitors may attempt to exploit these disclosures in the marketplace. True transparency always carries short-term competitive risk, I acknowledged. But attempting to obscure legitimate concerns typically causes greater long-term damage through erosion of trust. Elizabeth added a regulatory perspective. Organizations that demonstrate proactive correction and governance improvement typically experience more favorable regulatory outcomes than those attempting to minimize or conceal identified issues. The approach represented fundamental recommitment to the principles that had initially established Vertex's reputation, recognition that sustainable success in financial technology required prioritizing security and trust above momentary competitive advantage or quarterly metrics. The institutional learning reflected genuine recognition that Marcus Chen's philosophy had fundamentally misunderstood the requirements for enduring success in an industry where client trust represented the most valuable asset. As our drafting session concluded, Brandon raised a question that had likely occurred to everyone. Do we have any indication who provided this information to the publication? Patricia considered this thoughtfully before responding. The board has chosen not to initiate an investigation into the source. Their perspective is that the disclosure, while potentially challenging in the short term, ultimately serves the organization's legitimate interests by accelerating necessary correction. This judgment represented another significant shift from Marcus Chen's approach, which would likely have prioritized identifying and penalizing the information source rather than addressing the underlying concerns. The board's focus on substantive improvement rather than retribution demonstrated renewed commitment to organizational health beyond superficial control. By late afternoon, the response framework had received board approval, with Dr. Yamamoto personally reviewing the technical components to ensure accurate representation of both the issues and remediation process. The final document had been provided to the publication with authorization for Patricia Hernandez and Dr. Yamamoto to be quoted directly regarding Vertex's commitment to comprehensive correction and governance improvement. As I prepared to leave Vertex headquarters that evening, Elizabeth Carver stopped me in the lobby. Your influence on their response approach was significant, she observed. Many organizations in similar situations choose defensive positioning rather than substantive transparency. The credit belongs primarily to current leadership, I replied. Particularly Patricia's willingness to prioritize genuine correction over perception management. Elizabeth smiled slightly. Leadership creates the opportunity, but someone still needs to advocate for difficult truths. Your perspective helped shape an institutional response that may ultimately strengthen rather than damage Vertex's market position. Her observation highlighted an important reality that Marcus Chen had fundamentally misunderstood. In the financial technology sector, genuine trust ultimately mattered more than momentary advantage. Institutions processing financial transactions required partners who prioritized security and stability above acceleration and disruption, recognizing that innovation had enduring value only when built upon reliable foundations. The following morning, the anticipated article appeared with the headline, Vertex Technologies acknowledges security protocol modifications, details comprehensive restoration under regulatory oversight. The piece included direct quotations from Patricia Hernandez about Vertex's recommitment to the foundational security principles that established the company's reputation, alongside Dr. Yamamoto's detailed explanation of the governance improvements being implemented to ensure technical standards receive appropriate priority in future development processes. Most significantly, the article included confirmation from Elizabeth Carver that the State Financial Services Regulatory Commission was actively monitoring a comprehensive remediation process with appropriate verification protocols and client notification requirements. The market response was remarkably measured. Vertex stock declined approximately 3% in morning trading, but stabilized by midday, as financial analysts issued reports characterizing the situation as proactive governance correction, rather than fundamental organizational failure. Several analysts specifically noted the transparent approach as evidence of institutional maturity and recommitment to appropriate standards. Client response proved similarly constructive. Several financial institutions issued statements expressing appreciation for the direct communication regarding security considerations while confirming continued partnership with Vertex based on the comprehensive remediation process and regulatory oversight. Rather than triggering client exodus, the transparent acknowledgement appeared to be strengthening institutional relationships through demonstrated accountability. By early afternoon, Brandon reported that several major clients had contacted Vertex, requesting detailed briefings on the restoration process, not to evaluate continued partnership, but to understand how similar governance improvements might benefit their own organizations. The transparent approach was transforming a potential crisis into an opportunity for industry leadership regarding security governance. The board's executive committee held an emergency session to assess response to the public disclosure, with Dr. Yamamoto providing a detailed briefing on client and market reactions. Their conclusion, shared through Patricia to the executive team, reflected measured optimism. Initial responses suggest our transparency approach is rebuilding trust rather than diminishing it. Continue prioritizing substantive correction over perception management. Late that afternoon, Jonathan Ward called with his perspective on the unfolding situation. The board made the right decision embracing transparency, he noted, though it required significant institutional courage. The credit belongs primarily to current leadership, I observed, particularly Patricia's willingness to prioritize genuine correction over defensive positioning. Leadership enables the right decisions, Jonathan acknowledged, but someone still needed to advocate for transparency when defensive reactions would have been easier. Your influence has been significant, Sophia. His observation echoed Elizabeth's earlier comment, highlighting how organizational outcomes often depended on individual willingness to maintain principled perspective, even when expedient alternatives seemed superficially attractive. The transparent response hadn't emerged automatically, but required specific advocacy for uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable narratives. The interesting question, Jonathan continued, is how this experience will shape Vertex's future direction. Institutions often learn most effectively through successfully navigating challenges rather than avoiding them entirely. His observation reflected an important reality about organizational development, that meaningful growth typically emerged from effectively addressing difficulties rather than merely preventing them. Vertex was demonstrating impressive capacity to learn from its governance failures, potentially emerging stronger through substantive correction rather than superficial adaptation. The following days brought continued implementation of the security restoration process, with the technical team maintaining impressive momentum despite the public disclosure of the underlying issues. Brandon's leadership proved particularly valuable in maintaining focus on substantive correction rather than reputation management, prioritizing genuine security restoration over accelerated timelines that might create new vulnerabilities. 1 week after the public disclosure, Dr. Yamamoto convened a special governance committee meeting to assess progress on both technical restoration and institutional improvement. The session included comprehensive updates from each functional area alongside external perspective from regulatory representatives. The technical metrics are encouraging, Dr. Yamamoto noted as Brandon concluded his restoration update. But equally important are the governance improvements being implemented alongside security restoration. Patricia provided a detailed overview of the procedural changes already instituted, including restored technical review requirements, re-established compliance certification protocols, and enhanced client notification standards for security-relevant modifications. Most significantly, she outlined a structural reorganization that would establish permanent separation between innovation advocacy and security verification, ensuring appropriate checks and balances in future development processes. These structural improvements address a fundamental governance vulnerability, Dr. Yamamoto observed. Technical considerations must have equal weight in executive decisions, not merely advisory input that can be disregarded for expedience. The Governance Committee approved a comprehensive recommendation to the full board, proposing formalization of these procedural improvements alongside creation of the Chief Technical Integrity Officer position that Dr. Yamamoto had previously discussed with me. The structural changes would establish institutional safeguards against future governance failures by ensuring technical considerations received appropriate priority, regardless of market pressures or leadership preferences. As the meeting concluded, Patricia asked me to remain for a private conversation. Once others had departed, she addressed a consideration that extended beyond the current consulting arrangement. The Governance Committee will formally recommend creation of the Chief Technical Integrity Officer position to the full board tomorrow, she began, with explicit authority to require appropriate security and quality protocols even when affecting launch timelines or development costs. I nodded, recalling my previous discussion with Dr. Yamamoto about this structural improvement. That represents important institutional learning from the current situation. The board has authorized me to formally offer you this position once it's established, Patricia continued. Your demonstrated commitment to appropriate standards combined with your comprehensive system understanding makes you uniquely qualified. The offer represented remarkable institutional correction, from terminating my employment as outdated to creating an executive position specifically leveraging the systematic perspective and principled assessment that Marcus Chen had dismissed. Beyond personal validation, it reflected genuine organizational learning about the essential qualities required for sustainable success in financial technology. The position would report directly to the board rather than through the CEO, Patricia explained, with explicit authority regarding security and quality requirements regardless of timeline implications. The structure is specifically designed to prevent recurrence of the governance failures we've experienced. The reporting structure represented another significant improvement. Recognition that proper governance required balancing multiple values rather than exclusive focus on acceleration and market positioning. The architecture would institutionalize the principle that sustainable innovation required appropriate constraints rather than unlimited disruption. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.